Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor.
I thought what we should talk about today is violence. Since there seem to be more and more outbreaks of violence for various reasons, and it seems as though we should be able to explain this if we really understand what's going on. And the most unexpected thing probably was yesterday's firebombing of the offices of that French satirical magazine in Paris, which I think took everybody by surprise, although I suppose with hindsight it's not that different from other things that have happened. But it didn't seem to be reported very much in the American papers, as far as I could see.
No, not too much, but the magazine did go ahead and publish the cartoon today, nevertheless.
How did they do that?
I don't know. They may have put it on their website, or they may have also run a limited print edition, but they ran it.
Because,
of course, as you mentioned, in hindsight, we're reminded of the experience with the Danish newspaper that underwent tremendous protests, and I think there might have been at minimum some vandalism against that institution before they went ahead and printed the same anti-Islamic cartoon.
Anyway, it's going to be very interesting to see whether the French reaction to this incident in Paris is different from the Danish reaction some years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting not only because France tends to relate to this sort of thing differently, public opinion in France tends to relate differently to this sort of thing than public opinion in Denmark, but also because we're several years ahead and the processes that we're interested in of social change throughout the world are further developed, and so we might expect, I think, the reactions to be different. But it's what I think needs to be explained is how easy it is to elicit violent reaction. And there seems to be more and more violence going on in different parts of the world. I don't think there's been any violence in Greece that's significant in the last few days, but Oakland there certainly has, and the violence in Syria has been escalating again. People seem to be taking violence not necessarily for granted, but accepting it as a normal part of the way you deal with problems in a way that was never the case before.
Well, I think that is probably right. I would just say this, and I will say this only because anybody viewing this might want to say this, is that it seems as if Islam in particular has sort of a hair-trigger response to any perceived threat or defamation of the religion, and immediately resorts to violence. Now, you know, whether or not, I'd be interested in your view on that.
Well, we have to ask the question whether this is really representative of Islam, whether the people who did it are really reacting against an insult to the Prophet or a perceived insult to themselves. And we have to take note of the fact that if a Muslim does something like this, then it's reported as Muslim behavior, but if a Christian does something like this, it's not necessarily reported as general Christian behavior, but the behavior of particular ethnic groups or social types. And that there is a good historical reason for that, because Islam has always had a much higher awareness of its global unity than Christianity ever had. But I don't think that's actually what's behind the differences now.
I think that probably that's a good point, because it then leads into the discussion of, for example, when 2 students were killed in Greece last week during those protests, or when the protesters in the Occupy Wall Street movement set a bonfire at the gates to the port of Oakland that then shut down the port. You didn't see any categorization that there were Eastern Orthodox Christians or Protestants or Catholics who were setting those fires. There were people associated with social strife, people associated with social kinds of protest.
Well, they may not have been doing it in any association with Christianity, but when
of course not.
Incidents of violence have something to do with abortion, that very often is associated with Christian beliefs, but it's not reported as Christian behavior, I think. So there are things that we can make useful comparisons with, in the same way that often in this country particular ethnic groups will be reported as in any description of criminal behavior, and other ethnic groups won't be reported.
Well, how much violence of this type do you think is due to a belief on the part of those perpetrating it that it's simply an attempt to increase more press coverage, more attention? I mean, certainly the people in Oakland didn't think they were going to overcome the Oakland Police Department.
That's generally the problem with anything that has to do with information flow, I suppose. But I wonder, well, Manuel Castells, who's one of the major names in trying to make sense of what's going on in the globalization process, talks about the fourth world, and he uses it in a different sense from the way other people have used it. He uses it to mean what he calls the black holes of informational capitalism, information capitalism, by which he means that here and there all over the world, not in a particular part of the world, but as much in America and some parts of Europe as in Africa and other disadvantaged countries, there are groups of people who have been left out of the general flow of information, and boundaries grow up around them, and they react against this, and they become sources of violence and particularly good recruits for terrorism. Though he wouldn't try to explain all terrorism in this sense. But the problem, I think, in the modern world, in the process of globalization generally, is a problem of social boundaries, and people feeling that they're not a part of what is going on, or there's a group of people who think of themselves as different and the other side of a boundary, and therefore something has to be done to make clear that this boundary is unacceptable. But it's done in different ways, and this firebombing in Paris obviously is done in the name of particular identities, and this brings up another thing that has to do with globalization, which is that the Muslim world generally was held in a sort of straitjacket of colonial administration for 100 years, roughly from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, and since then has been gradually becoming reintegrated into the processes of social change that the rest of the world has been undergoing. But it still hasn't got over the fact that it was in a different status and held in check for so long, and that generates social boundaries, or a perception of social boundaries, and people are still reacting against that.
Well, there's two things that come to mind in what you just said. First is there seems to be not that it ever went away, but a reintroduction of that social concept of the other, almost back from the time of the Greeks, when they began to call anybody who didn't speak Greek barbarians, because to the Greek ear it sounded as if they were speaking ba 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 ba, and it became barbarians. This is a Jeremy McInerney tidbit, just for your own information. And of course, that concept of the other allows a group to really commit any sort of violence against the other in a very justifiable way. So that comes to mind. The second thing that comes to mind is what is going on in Syria now. And those people have publicly chanted that they're willing to serve as martyrs in order to get the global attention, almost forcing Assad to resort to violence in order to kill them, in order to raise the ante. And it's almost confounding to me that right on the heels of this alleged acceptance by the Syrian government of the Arab League supposed peace treaty, the people voted with their blood. They were like, no, no, this isn't enough. You know, we're going to go out and we're going to force him to shoot, and we're going to let the world know that this is hardly a peace treaty.
Very interesting that the Arab League has taken some initiative, but expressed the proposal for a truce in terms which are not concrete enough, and therefore, I mean, obviously the purpose is to have language that might be acceptable to both sides, but it finishes up being acceptable to neither side, and therefore the violence has escalated again. But I wonder whether we can shift our attention away from the reasons for it and ask a question about why violence, whether there's always been this sort of violence as an obvious reaction to discontent, or whether people actually resort to violence more now than they ever did before. And if they do, then how can we make sense of that? And does it mean that violence is going to continue to increase in the coming years as globalization progresses? And if so, then we've got a real problem on our hands. How are we going to contain violence? We can't, even if we could capture everybody and put them in behind bars, we don't have big enough bars to hold everybody. It seems as though attitudes towards violence and readiness to indulge in violence have been changing.
Well, your view, I take it, would mean that the attitude toward violence has meant that it's become more acceptable to use violence.
I'm not sure whether it's accepted, but it's, well, I suppose you have to say it's accepted. But I wonder whether it has to do with the way we think about other people now, and that we think about other people now differently simply because there are more of them. And even when we know how to identify ourselves in relation to other people, since there are so many, our identity groups are so much larger than they used to be, that even the sharing of an identity has a different meaning now from what it used to have. That all the relationships that we were brought up, were socialized to expect in life, now have a somewhat different quality to them, because marriage isn't what it used to be, households aren't what they used to be, nationalism isn't what it used to be. None of these identities are the same. And violence, of course, has always been a part of human history, but it was suppressed for a long time. And I think those of us who can remember what life was like before the 1950s, which I'm beginning to think of as a useful threshold for understanding where the qualitative change of modern life began, will remember that you could live a normal daily life and not be aware of violence at all, which doesn't mean to say that there was no violence, but it was kept out of the way. There really wasn't so much of it. And that's not possible for anybody anymore.
No, I would tend to agree with you. And as we were chatting earlier, or by email, you mentioned the recent public survey in Britain, in which most people over there now believe that young people in Britain are feral, and in fact are completely beyond saving, and are almost in a wild state. And clearly, that's the next step would be down. The next step down that food chain would be that they're violent and beyond being salvaged.
Well, I think the reason that feral is being used to talk about them is that they are committing acts of violence, and there's really criminal acts of violence occurring that involves children not just below the age of adulthood, but below the age of 10. And this has to be put down to the fact that children aren't socialized anymore. They don't grow up having internalized any cultural rules. And that raises the question, well, what does govern their behavior then? And one has to assume it's something that has to do with their genetic programming, And so we then need to look and see what primate ethologists can tell us about the possible history of human behavior before we became a separate species. And I actually went to listen to a lecture on that last night and came away very disappointed, because I felt that the primate ethologists were interpreting primate behavior in terms of their own middle-class American ethnic background and finding it wanting, but not actually telling us what we need to know about how the way primates relate to each other. It might be behind some of the things that are going on with the relaxation of cultural rules in the modern world. I think we've got to the end of our time without noticing it. Must have been a particularly interesting topic that we must come back to.
Well, I would like to at some point pick up on this primate discussion. Very interesting. All right, thank you for your time, Professor.